The Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development will come to order. I note there's a quorum is present. Without objections, the chair is recognized to call a recess at any time. I'd also like to welcome committee members who are not members of the subcommittee and are waiving on to this process for today's hearing. Thank you for joining us today for this very timely and consequential hearing. I want to begin by expressing sympathy for the Jewish members of our community that have felt endangered, discouraged, and disappointed by the exposure of the anti-Semitism throughout our country. I also want to thank our witnesses for coming forward to testify and working with our committee during this difficult time of upheaval. This committee is convened today to address the scourge of anti-Semitism spreading like wildfire on college campuses. As a first step toward eradicating this evil, this committee has invited Jewish campus and community leaders to help us understand the source of this proliferation. I recognize that anti-Semitism is not a new problem. It has taken on various forms throughout our history, the most noted prior to October 7th were the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. Both will be forever remain a stain in the annals of human history. The modern form of anti-Semitism is more subtle, for it is often disguised under progressive political innuendos. For example, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, steeped deeply in the doctrine of Marxism, is anything but inclusive for Jews. Evidence shows that campus DEI bureaucracies play a major role in propagating the spread of anti-Semitism. There's a dirty little secret at the heart of DEI as it seeks to dismantle systems of oppression. It divides the world into oppressors and the oppressed, ascribing collective guilt to the oppressors and collective innocence to the oppressed. But what does this mean for the Jewish community? You would think the DEI industry would be sympathetic to the Jewish people's history of oppression, persecution, and wholesale slaughter. But no, the DEI hierarchy places the Jewish people at the very bottom of the oppression spectrum. A study from the Heritage Foundation explains that how diversity officers fuel anti-Semitic fire. After searching through the Twitter feeds of 741 campus DEI personnel, the Heritage J. Green found that 96% of the Israel-related tweets were either critical of Israel or explicitly anti-Semitic. DEI programs are, at its core, anti-Semitic because it ascribes collective guilt to the entire state of Israel for the mere existence. The core principles of this Marxist ideology is not diversity, equity, or inclusion. It is instead discrimination, intolerance, and bigotry toward individuals thought to belong to a wrong group. So rather than curbing discrimination on campuses, these DEI bureaucracies stoke racial tensions. A report from the National Association of Scholars found that DEI officials routinely organize race-segregated events, race-exclusive affinity groups, race-segregated spaces such as black-only dorms, black-only graduations, and race-specific training. You literally cannot make this stuff up. If it reminds anyone of the hate-fueled 1960s days of Deep South Jim Crow segregation and the roaming gangs of KKK bullies, it's because it is. Hopefully our witnesses from Yale, Ms. Tartak, can speak more about her experiences with campus DEI and if it made her feel included. I cannot think of a time since the 1960s when a group of students were more blatantly targeted, harassed, bullied, intimidated, and physically assaulted than Jewish students in the last month. Swastika graffitied over campuses, Jewish students being segregated in classrooms by their professors, Jewish students at the New York City's Cooper Union being forced to lock themselves in a college library and later escorted out the back door. What is the core of this problem? A gang of face-covering, cowardly bullies who feel no shame and who feel no sphere of accountability from college administrators where this hate is being taught. Chants for genocide ring loudly. A Cornell history professor called the pure evil of the terrorist attack on civilian innocence exhilarating. While anti-Semitic speech might be free, it deserves our moral condemnation. With respect to all free speech, this committee fully supports students' rights to political expression. What we do not and will not support is terrorism and threats of violence. We can no longer support the use of taxpayer dollars to cultivate, nourish, and grow hate on our campuses. I look forward to hearing from our witness accounts of exclusive, and divisiveness that are now being propagated and promoted throughout our country. DEI definitely plays a large role in fomenting this hate. But in what other areas should we look at to hold our universities accountable? Once again, I thank you for being here. And with that, I yield to the ranking member for his opening statement. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony today. It's been over a month since Hamas's terrorist attack on innocent civilians in Israel and the start of a brutal, ongoing war in Gaza. This conflict has directly devastated thousands of people, Israelis and Palestinians alike, and countless families and friends across the world and in the United States. Tragically, but not surprisingly, this conflict has also been marked by a rise in both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidences in America's colleges and universities. And to be clear, this discrimination is nothing new. Any student of history knows that it did not start with the current war, foreign influences, or any new philosophy. Our colleagues would do well to recall this country's century-long history of racism and anti-Semitism. We can all agree that free speech is a constitutional right and bedrock of our democracy, and colleges and universities have been on the front lines of advancing that right for decades. But we should also be able to agree that schools have a responsibility to protect students' civil rights and safety. And if they don't want to agree to that, Title VI makes it clear that they have that responsibility. Under President Biden's direction, the Department of Education has recently provided additional guidance to colleges and universities on how to uphold their obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and better address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination on campus. And while the Biden administration has taken an active role in helping institutions protect students, regrettably, many of my colleagues have spent this Congress fueling divisive and baseless culture wars. Moreover, this week, Congress will consider a government funding bill that includes cuts for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, the very agency charged with protecting students from discrimination. So today, I hope my Republican colleagues will denounce the culture wars that have distracted us from protecting our vulnerable students, and I hope we can all stand behind the Biden administration's critical work to ensure that every student and educator has access to a campus free from discrimination, harassment, and violence. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Pursuant to Committee Rules 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. 14 days after this hearing, which is November 28, 2023. Without objections, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such transactions and statements and materials referenced during this hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I will now turn to the introduction of our four distinguished witnesses. Our first witness is Rabbi Moshe Howard, who is Executive Vice President of the Orthodox Union, which is located in New York City, New York. Our next witness is Mr. Kenneth Marcus, who is the founder and chairman of Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law, which is located in Washington, D.C. Our third witness is Ms. Stacy Burdett, who is an independent consultant in anti-Semitism prevention and response and is located in Washington, D.C. And our final witness is Ms. Sahar Tartak, who's a student at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to community rules, I would ask that each of you limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I'd also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I'd like to first recognize Rabbi Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee. My name is Rabbi Moshe Hauer. I have the privilege to serve as the Executive Vice President of the Orthodox Union, which is the largest organization serving Orthodox Jews in the world. But I'm not standing here or sitting here today simply in that capacity. I work day to day together with colleagues across the Jewish community, all of us, are engaged in our future, who are our students on campus. We have an organization that services our communities on campus, and we work side by side with other organizations such as Hillel and Chabad, serving Jewish students of all types on our campuses, and I hope in these remarks to be able to represent them and to present to you, in addition to the many specific stories, some of which the chairman mentioned and cited, and others which you will hear here today and will hear, unfortunately and sadly, in the future, to give you a bit of a sense of the bigger picture. Our organization, like others in the Jewish space, we place educators on Jewish campus, on university campuses, educators who are there, who enter the field in order to be able to provide a home on campus for Jewish students, to help nurture their sense of community, their sense of identity, to have a place to come together to celebrate Jewish holidays and the Sabbath, to study, to eat together, to maintain their sense of community, of their faith community. Today, the entire community of Jews on campus do not need a home, they need a fortress. People who went into this field in order to be able to educate and to nurture, instead find themselves, despite their own trauma and their own fear, having to spend their time just caring for the trauma and the fear of their students. Day to day, instead of educating, they're protecting. They're counseling people, students, how to avoid danger, how to navigate a class where the professor, where the staff that's in the class is creating a hostile environment for the students. The notion of being able to be there, to build, to grow, where the campus is a nurturing environment for all of its students, is unfortunately not their reality. Once upon a time, Jews were not admitted to these campuses. Today, we've come a long way. Jews are admitted to every campus. But today, unlike a short time ago, that admission introduces them to an environment where they experience fear and hostility. Which is better, to not be allowed in or to be welcomed and then to be intimidated? Title VI, as you will hear from my friend and colleague, Ken Marcus, Title VI ensures that our environments, our federally funded environments, our university environments are supposed to provide a place where all students are welcome. And what we are experiencing today is a test case in non-compliance to Title VI. I would also like to make a last point, and that is to draw you back to the big picture of how the Jewish community, the students and the Jewish community as a whole, are experiencing this moment. We are the people of the book, and that book contains values and morals, and it tells us our story. We all know our story, and this is the story of the Jewish people in a nutshell. We've been around for a few thousand years. We come to a country where we live, where we wander to. We thrive there. We contribute to the community, and after a period of time, that country spits us out. That's been our story. We live with it. We know it, and we didn't think it was going to happen here. We believed that the United States of America, built as it is on the principles of liberty and freedom and civil rights, would never spit us out. We never imagined, not 5 years ago, not 1 year ago, that we would be sitting here in this committee room because of the kind of vile and terrible anti-Semitism which is being directed at us on campuses. It's in your hands. You are our elected officials. We've entrusted you to bring back the liberty and freedom to our land, to make our community believe again that America will be different.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Appreciate that. I would next recognize Mr. Marcus.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Scott, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be here today for this briefing. I thank you for holding it and for including me. I am the chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. We speak every day with Jewish students who are facing anti-Semitism on college campuses. A month ago, shortly before the 7th of October, I would have told you that we were facing historic levels of campus anti-Semitism, worse than we had ever seen before. But that was nothing like what we've seen since then. During the weeks following October 7th, we had more than a tenfold increase in intake as compared to the historic levels that we've been seeing before that. And that was even before we announced a joint program with the Anti-Defamation League and Hillel to do intake together, at which point it skyrocketed above that. We have a crisis today on America's campuses. This is an emergency, and I would suggest to this committee that when the problem is exceptional and unprecedented, the solutions need to be unprecedented and exceptional. My testimony describes some of what's happening on college campuses, but the chairman's opening remarks reflects an understanding of that. Students are being assaulted, students are being threatened, there's vandalism, there's harassment of all sorts, not just on a few hotspot campuses, but all over this country, including at institutions that we had previously considered to be entirely safe for Jewish students. Let me suggest, if I may, a few answers, because there are things that can be done, especially under the statute that Rabbi Hauer mentioned, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Biden administration has addressed anti-Semitism in various ways, and I think should be praised for issuing a national strategy on anti-Semitism. The Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, which I formerly headed at the U.S. Department of Education, has issued Dear Colleague letters and has had various meetings and public events, which I think are helpful. But much of that was what I would call October 6th thinking. We are now in an emergency. Here are a few things that should be done, certainly within the next 30 days. Number one, the Secretary of Education has authority to institute compliance reviews. When I served in the George W. Bush and Trump administrations, when there was a matter of national importance that we wanted to address and bring public attention to, we would establish a nationwide initiative with investigations proactively addressed through all of the regions of the agency. That would put significant resources, but also raise public attention. There is no need to simply wait for complaints to come in. The agency can reach out. Second, even short of compliance initiative, the agency has the power to institute self-directed investigations. Jewish communal organizations like mine are thinly stretched. We are providing complaints where we can, as fast as we can, but the U.S. Department of Education has the authority anytime it opens the newspaper or watches the news to investigate in those cases, of which there are many, in which it is apparent that there are issues of noncompliance with federal law. Third, Executive Order 13899 on combating anti-Semitism. The Biden administration has committed over and over again to issue regulations implementing President Trump's former executive order on combating anti-Semitism, which remains active policy, but lacks the durability of a regulation. This has been delayed and delayed again. It is now due next month in December. It would be unfortunate at a period of extreme anti-Semitism for this to be delayed again, and yet there's been no mention of it in either the national strategy or the most recent OCR report to this Congress and the President. At a minimum, the administration should do what it has promised and what it had promised long before October 7 and issue the notice of proposed rulemaking regarding Executive Order 13899. Fourth, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. That's up to this Congress, not the executive branch. But there is legislation that has been introduced that would formalize and codify the executive order established by the last president, President Donald Trump. This would provide tools needed by OCR in order to ensure that there will be consistent standard use of the understanding of anti-Semitism. Those are four things, but in general what we need is not just good words, not just an occasional letter, but a combination of strong guidance and, most importantly, proactive action. There is no need to simply wait for complaints to come in. The federal government should take action, and there's no reason why it cannot do so within these next 30 days. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Marcus. I will now recognize Ms. Burnett.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Owens and Ranking Member Scott, for this opportunity. Anti-Semitism isn't just a threat to Jews, it's a threat to democratic norms and American values. Its presence has always been a warning sign about the health of free democratic societies. All the members here have noted that what we're seeing isn't new. It follows the core logic of anti-Semitism throughout history. It's a lie to blame Jews for what's wrong in the world. You've also recognized anti-Semitism is a feature, not a bug, of American society and history. The demand for a better life for Palestinians is a worthy cause, but attacks on Jewish students have nothing to do with criticism of Israel's policy or actions. They don't serve Palestinian freedom or advance any peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians. Here's what some of the most responsive universities I've seen have in common. Number one, they get that this isn't business as usual. We've heard from the other panelists, October 6th was a different world. They've been communicating steadily and repeatedly with students and faculty to remind them anti-Semitism violates, first of all, the university's values. There are rules, there are parameters around protests. They've increased security, services like escorts and hotlines to report threats. Some have formed anti-Semitism task forces to look system-wide at policies and even their academic offerings. We hear the call from communities, where are my allies? Jews need support, we need solidarity, and we need recognition that anti-Semitism is serious. And that's why organizations like the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League see DEI as a critical framework for their work. They're investing in DEI-compatible education material about anti-Semitism. It's true, Jews don't fit neatly into the protected categories. It's not rocket science to fix that. So enhance it. Don't make us the excuse to shut down something important. Pushing back against anti-Semitism means we need an all-hands-on-deck approach across society. And the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism is a comprehensive roadmap. It's already being implemented across federal agencies. The Department of Education and 8 new agencies have made crystal clear anti-Semitism, discrimination against Jews violates civil rights laws. They have pledged and are taking action. They're being proactive, whether it's revising complaint forms, starting education campaigns, and training their investigators and staff. The national strategy is a serious plan. If Congress is serious, then implement your part of it. But look, I'm a mom of a kid on a college campus. Enforcement isn't my goal, it's my worst nightmare. There's not a single more important way to help a Jewish student on campus than to prevent the attack from happening in the first place. We have to give our kids more than bulletproof glass and barricades. Prevention isn't an extra, not with any kind of crime and not with anti-Semitic hate crimes. Hate doesn't just frighten people, it isolates them. And that's why community solidarity building is such a key focus of Jewish organizations and of the national strategy. That's how we can make fighting anti-Semitism a community value, an American civic value. And how can we effectively stop a problem that we can't measure? Anti-Semitic crimes are rising, and the number of police agencies who bother to track it is at a 5-year low. That's something you can take action on. People who work on this issue agree it's time to make this reporting mandatory. Anti-Semitism has been alive in this country for generations, but what we've seen, not just on campuses now, on the streets of Charlottesville and Poway and Muncie and at Cornell, well, there's no quick fix to put this poison back in the bottle. You have 4 witnesses here, but please use the roadmap from the White House that has serious input from over 1,000 organizations and Jewish community stakeholders. If you do, a lot of Americans will be better allies to Jews and each other. The Jewish community and the American community will be stronger for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Burdett. Last but not least, I'd like to recognize Ms. Tartak. Yes.
There's a Jewish concept that encourages bringing light into times of darkness through acts of loving kindness. So I'll begin by dropping a few coins into this charity box, and I would encourage you to do the same. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, good morning. My name is Sahar Tartak, and I am an Orthodox Persian Jewish student at Yale University. Thank you for having me speak. It is an honor, and I appreciate your service to this country. I am humbled before you. Noting your commitment to democracy and the free world, I want to paint a picture of how, since Hamas's October 7th massacres, college campuses have become a place for the opposite, a love of Hamas and all the oppression it represents. Since October 7th, there has been a 400% increase in reported anti-Semitic incidents of vandalism, harassment, and assault in comparison to the same time frame in the previous year across America. Let's start with Yale, my own university where I received death threats for my Jewish activism, and the Ivy League institution refuses to provide me with direct protection. That's just the beginning. I haven't had time to mourn the murder of over 1,400 members of my Jewish family across the sea. I haven't had time to cry. I've been too busy handling an interdepartmentally sponsored Yale event entitled, quote, Gaza Under Siege. My Jewish friends and I were barred from entry. We pressed our ears against the door for 2 hours listening, quote, the Israeli state cannot remain the state of the Jewish people. Quote, Israel aims to inflict as much harm, damage, and death as possible. Quote, Panelists refused to label Hamas, quote, terrorists, let alone to condemn them when asked. They instead justified their brutalities, saying, quote, violent resistance movements often emerge in colonized spaces. An official Yale University response declared that, quote, opinions and positions from people of all backgrounds were expressed respectfully during the program, but we heard nothing of the sort from behind the door. The week before that, I also didn't have time to cry. I was too busy with the Yale Daily News, the oldest collegiate paper in the country, redacting my mention of Hamas's raping women and beheading men from an article I published for the paper, deeming these atrocities unsubstantiated. Yale's administration made no comment. The week before that, I didn't have time to cry because I went to film one of many pro-Hamas protests at Yale where hundreds of my peers gleefully yelled, quote, resistance is justified. Yale's administration made no comment. The week before that, I wrote an article about the officially recognized campus group Yalees for Palestine publicly, quote, celebrating the resistance's success. Not to mention similar statements made by university professors. Again, the Yale University administration did nothing. Again, I didn't have time to cry. On campus, I sit in a crowded dining hall, and I ask myself, how many people in this room want me dead? You have no doubt heard about assaults and intimidation of Jewish students at Cornell, Columbia, and Cooper Union. You've heard about the words, glory to our martyrs, projected onto George Washington University's library. Those Jews also didn't have time to cry. You may not, however, have heard about my Jewish friend, a freshman whose residential counselor laughed contemptuously at a survivor of the Nova Music Festival massacre for visiting their university to detail his trauma. Others told me they're uncomfortable approaching their own professors for help with coursework because they're openly pro-Hamas. Another slept on a friend's couch because her roommate supports Hamas. One attended a seemingly innocent dance concert whose program featured a donation link to, quote, support Palestinian anarchist fighters on the front lines of resistance. I wonder where that was going. They've all receded into Jewish centers exclusively for reasons which are crystal clear. Universities have allowed Jew hatred to run rampant. If they fail to protect their Jewish students, they should be stripped of their federal funding. They must derecognize and defund student groups that promote violence, calling for, quote, intifada, or supporting U.S. designated terrorist organizations. The federal government cannot subsidize hotbeds of anti-Semitism. The Department of Education should proactively open Title VI investigations, not just receive them passively. Diversity, equity, and inclusion offices should be scrutinized for protecting every minority group other than mine. This is not an exhaustive list, but I urge you to mobilize on this issue. Do not abandon your Jewish students during this crisis. Academia has turned its back on us. Will you do the same?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pursuant to the previous order, the chair declares the subcommittee in recess, subject to the call of the chair for votes on the House floor. We will reconvene immediately following the last vote in the series. Thank you. The committee stands in recess. Committee will come to order. Under Committee Rule 9, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will begin this process. Rabbi Howard, in your testimony, you made a striking statement. You said that Jewish students need a fortress now rather than a home. Can you tell me more what this looks like? In other words, are the mentors that are Orthodox Union and other organizations place, have they have the protection that they need for the Jewish students? And has that changed in recent years, especially since the Hamas attack?
Thank you for the question. It has changed. It has changed dramatically. It's changed over the years, yes, as you will hear from all of us. October 6th, we were also dealing with an intensely a fearful and changed campus environment, and it has multiplied exponentially since October 7th. Yes, our professionals, our educators are spending, as I said in the original testimony as well, they're spending a lot of time counseling students about environment, about how to respond, how to report, how to navigate what has become an increasingly unfriendly environment. Our Jewish students on campus, when they come to the place, they're very often they're doing something which is really essential to themselves and to their identity. They can't and they shouldn't need to melt into a campus environment by hiding who they are. The ability to convene in Jewish spaces, but Jewish spaces are targeted. People are seeking extra security. One of the things that we're working together as Jewish organizations is to bring greater physical security to Jewish spaces on campus and surrounding the Jewish students. And that's the story of the fortress. Our leaders are struggling to make their voices heard in university administrations in order to be able to bring out the proper reaction. All such administrations should be having serious discussions about how they restore a sense of safety and freedom to Jewish students. Many of our educators are trying to be on the front lines of doing that. Sometimes they are welcomed. Sometimes their voices are welcomed. Sometimes the process begins. Too frequently, they're struggling to be able to do it. And I could just tell you, if I may, myself, I am by career, before I assumed this position, which is for a national organization of congregations, I was a congregational rabbi. I'm a teacher. I went into this business in order to be able to work with people to build Jewish identity. I did not get into the business in order to be able to argue about the rights of Jews to exist.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Tartak, you noted that the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion offices should be questioned for protecting every minority group. I personally think that the diversity, equity, and inclusion is a fraud. And what we're seeing now in our campuses across the country is proof of that. What is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office at Yale doing to protect you and your other Jewish students on campus? And from what you've heard, other peers and other campuses?
So Yale Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion offices and organizations alike have done nothing for me and my friends, and the horrifying experiences that I detailed in my testimony. Surveys of DEI organizations on college campuses have found that only 2 in 24 even address anti-Semitism, and if and when they refuse to step in for Jews, I know what comes next.
Okay, thank you. In the few seconds we have left, Mr. Marcus, you've heard the voices of the left express concerns about the pro-Hamas students not being given their free right of speech. Yet in your testimony, you noted that Brandeis Center, over half the Jewish fraternities and sorority students surveyed expressed avoiding their views on Israel because of the concerns they might have for themselves. Do you have any comments on that? Any further comments on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly, I would say that we speak every day with students who feel that they are unable to express their Jewish identity on campus without various forms of punishment or social stigmatization. Jewish students for whom Zionism is an integral part of their identity are in particular unable to do so. They are finding that they are excluded from student government positions or subjected to impeachment votes or otherwise excluded.
Thank you so much. I now recognize Mr. McConnell. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am appalled by the rise of anti-Semitism amid a painful and precarious moment in light of the October 7th attack launched against Israel. And I'd like to take this opportunity to address a recent vote that I took, and so that folks can understand why I did what I did. Congressman Owens, the chairman, introduced a resolution titled condemning the support of Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations at institutions of higher education, which may lead to the creation of a hostile environment for Jewish students, faculty, and staff. To be clear, the early draft of this resolution was a resolution that I intended to support. I believe that condemning the actions, the heinous actions of Hamas was an important thing for Congress to express and to express maybe something different that was going on many of our nation's campuses. However, the resolution that came to the floor for a vote differed vastly from the initial version. The subsequent iteration contained added whereas clauses, many of which misrepresented instances of anti-Semitism on college campuses. Congress has a responsibility to remain truthful above all else. If we are misrepresenting data to present a false narrative or perpetuate a narrative which may provide some political gain, then we are providing a disservice to those we represent. So after much thought and deliberation, I voted against the resolution because it was overly broad and implied university administrations are not challenging or properly responding to instances of anti-Semitism, notwithstanding what our witness here has testified today. I do realize that some administrators have not acted with appropriate alacrity. One of the whereas clauses in this resolution included an instance of a Stanford lecturer targeting Jewish students. From what I heard, it was a despicable moment. This did not depict, however, a full, accurate picture because the text of the resolution failed to recognize that the instructor was subsequently suspended by Stanford University. A second mischaracterization occurred on page 2 of the text, which read, quote, whereas on October 22nd, 2023, the Brandeis University student government voted down a simple resolution condemning Hamas and calling on the immediate release of all hostages back to their families unharmed, end quote. Now, this could have done potential harm to the students at Brandeis University who were mischaracterized as having failed to condemn Hamas. Inaccurate reporting misconstrued the dynamics of a student Senate vote that concerned process and procedure. The Brandeis Student Union had not issued any statement that supported Hamas, and they actually vigorously condemned the attack. This resolution should not have been included in a congressional resolution. Misreporting prompted the Brandeis University president to set the record straight, and he released a formal statement entitled Setting the Record Straight. And the statement expressed what the university unequivocally stands with Israel. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent for this letter to be entered into the record.
No objection.
Now, the pro-Israel organization J Street further recommended to members to object to the Owens resolution, citing concerns with the implication that universities were not acting to address instances of anti-Semitism. Some of my colleagues have attempted to seize an opportunity to divide the Democratic caucus with gotcha resolutions and bad faith attempts to condemn anti-Semitism, which is what the resolution, in my view, ended up being. Competing resolutions have been introduced which support Jewish students without perpetuating any falsehoods, and such as the Kustoff-Wassman-Schultz resolution. And I was proud to be an early signer of this resolution to condemn anti-Semitism on college campuses and encourage higher education leaders to respond to incitements of violence. If we could only have passed that resolution instead. This hearing presents a unique opportunity to discuss the balance between First Amendment protections and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And I'm running out of time, but I am convinced, as from the testimony from Ms. Burdett, that we can strike that balance and we can meet the challenge of the moment for Jewish students on campus and all students. And that is our duty as representatives, and that is the duty of our government, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Chavez-Durima.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Over the course of my life, I cannot think of a more terrifying time for the Jewish community. Hamas, a terrorist organization which violently oppresses and sacrifices Palestinians in Gaza, carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And immediately, university students and administrations proudly took up the banner of Hamas. The sole interest of Hamas in using Palestinians as collateral damage in their extremist aim to kill every last Jew remaining in the world. And yet so many students and universities didn't hesitate to make it clear that being Jewish is justified cause for harassment, assault, death threats, and murder. The question has to be asked, why is anti-Semitism such a shared sickness in American universities? For many elite institutions, Jewish students were prohibited from attending for a significant period of their existence. And if American history has taught us anything, it's that ingrained racism is something you have to force out of institutions. It doesn't disappear on its own. Mr. Marcus, are you able to further provide the committee the historical context of anti-Semitism in American universities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I agree entirely with your remarks. Speaking as a practitioner as opposed to a historian, I can tell you that 20 years ago when I first dealt with this issue, we had faced a half century of progress, ending roughly with the onset of the Second Intifada. But over these last 2 decades, the situation has turned around, getting worse over 20 years, but with accelerating deterioration during the last several years, with a particular spike since October 7, with college campuses, places where you would expect toleration, providing exactly the opposite of that.
Ms. Tartak, thank you for being here, being so brave. In your view, at Yale and other universities, how has the systemic anti-Semitism been able to maintain itself in this modern era?
Thank you for the question. So the sense that I've gotten from university administrations and the reason why they seem to really be failing to handle this issue is because somehow it has been successfully politicized. To be more specific, so that administrations and I would say, pro-Hamas students and faculty view any condemnation as anti-Semitism somehow as another form of bigotry against Muslims or Palestinians, which is why we wind up with statement after statement of both sidesism when a Jewish student is harassed or assaulted. This happened at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. A student was beaten up. A Jewish student was beaten up while holding an Israeli flag. They then came back and took a knife and destroyed the flag. And then the university's statement said, we condemn anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and maybe they also said all other forms of bigotry. This is just, it's pure evidence. They cannot condemn anti-Semitism by itself. And so that's a really good way of erasing anti-Semitism when it happens.
Thank you. You being here gives me, and I imagine everyone here, a lot of hope. The past dictates the present, and it seems clear that universities have not seriously reckoned with how historic anti-Semitism has arguably gotten stronger in the modern era of academia. As an American, I pray that there can be a resolution to this hatred. As a member of Congress, I remain determined to continue working to ensure the existence of Jewish people is protected. No person should ever fear for their safety on account of their race, color, or creed. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Courtney.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. Again, want to first of all acknowledge resident of New Haven, Connecticut, Ms. Tartak, for your testimony today and your work at Yale Daily News, where I think combined along with many other voices, the external pressure to really eradicate anti-Semitism, is going to again have a lot of strength in the coming days, and that's certainly hopefully what we're going to achieve with this hearing today. In New London, Connecticut, a little further up the coastline, we have a situation where a family has a relative, Liat Benin Atzili, and her husband, Aviv Atzili, who were in kibbutz near Oz on the day of the October 7th. Liat, who is a dual citizen, and that's the family in New London, she is still a hostage in Gaza, and my office has been working with the family and the U.S. Embassy in Israel, as well as the State Department, tracking the situation. So again, even though in the U.S. events may seem like they're far away, but they're all very local. And as I said, your presence here today as someone living in Connecticut, again, is much appreciated. Ms. Burdett, your work with the Anti-Defamation League, which I think has really been the absolute bedrock institution that has been whose mission is to identify anti-Semitism for decades and decades, as well as to address it. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your comments regarding the Civil Rights Division, both in the Department of Education as well as the Department of Justice, and the role they play in terms of providing a real legal remedy in terms of trying to advance the cause of anti-Semitism.
Both in the Department of Justice and Education, it's been very important that those offices have restated, re-upped the truth and the message that anti-Semitism is a violation of civil rights. It's something that needed reiterating. We need to be translating resources for victims into Hebrew and Yiddish. All of those things that those offices do make a difference in someone's life. And I think, I hope Congress will fully fund the DOJ's prevention programs, because if we prevent bias-motivated violence against targeted victims, we will protect Jews. So let's do that. And I think those offices, it's not only their enforcement role that's important, it's the difference they can make in the lives of someone who needs support because something has happened to them, how they respond, how they communicate with communities. And like I said, all I hear from Jewish students is, where are our allies? Where are people in other communities standing up for me? Well, we can't hear that cry and then think that building solidarity, when our local officials do work that brings community together, they are building a social fabric that protects people. It's
Right.
not an add-on.
So on page 8 of your testimony, again, one of the headings is when students call, make sure there's enough investigators to answer. And again, that really, at this particular moment, is an issue that's right in play. We are about to vote on the budgets of the Department of Justice and the Department of Education with the spending bills, which my colleagues on the other side's Appropriations Committee reported out. And the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice is looking at a $41 million cut from their budget, and the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Education is looking at a $35 million cut. I've been around Congress for a while. Talk is cheap. Budgets matter in terms of whether or not, again, there's someone to answer the phone and actually put pressure on institutions, whether it's higher education, employers, you name it, where anti-Semitism is rearing its head, that we actually have the resources in play to provide a real remedy. I mean, it's a basic first-year law student maxim that when there is no remedy, there is no right. That's Marshall versus Madison, one of the bedrock cases out of the U.S. Supreme Court. And these budgets really raise a question whether or not there's going to be a remedy. Again, in 15 seconds left, maybe you'd like to sort of comment on that.
Republicans and Democrats have complained to the Department of Education about their backlog, about their alacrity, and I don't understand how we can complain about a group of people not getting through 19,000 cases when they were not set up. They are not equipped to handle that deluge. And I can tell you from my experience, the complaints that are going to be coming in are going to be real, they're going to be hard, and they are going to need investigative capacity. So let's get busy and let's put people in those chairs. I agree with you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Gruffman.
Yes, I guess we'll start on with this question. Right now, there's been a lot of concern, a lot written about from Mr. Marcus, a lot written about the lack of diversity on college campuses. Very strong to the left. There's been an increasing role of DEI sort of programs in which left-wingers are hired by colleges and universities. Do you feel that these people are contributing at all to anti-Israel sentiment, or is there a correlation between the increase in anti-Semitism and an increase in these sort of employees in college campuses?
Congressman, there are some people in the DEI field who are doing good work and even helping Jewish students, but there are three fundamental problems. First, DEI programs often do not even mention anti-Semitism or Jewish identity in their training programs. Second, studies from the University of Arkansas show that often DEI professionals, especially in higher education, have strong anti-Israel views that cross a line into anti-Semitism, so they would not be the appropriate people to go to at any rate. Third, oftentimes DEI programs are built on an ideology which creates a dichotomy between oppressor and oppressed, between white supremacist and BIPOC, and too often Jews are viewed as being ultra-white oppressors, which means that regardless of whether Jews are mentioned or not as a discrete minority, the entire process, the entire ideology is structured too often against the Jewish people.
We're told, I mean, I talked to some people whose children are mistreated on college campuses. They notice a lot of BLM signs or that sort of thing, sometimes connected with this sort of thing. Is there a correlation between BLM, or are they weighing in one way or other on these incidents?
Mr. Chairman, was that for me?
Yeah.
You're asking about correlation with Black Lives Matter and the problem we see on campus. So what I would say is that the Black Lives Matter movement stands for a lot of different things for different people, but the movement has, in various places, including for a significant period on its website, had strongly anti-Zionist messaging, and sometimes also has that perspective in the work it does. The Jewish community tends to support efforts to make sure that all minorities are supported, but the particular group that you mentioned, unfortunately, does have an anti-Zionist background that can be hurtful.
Okay, as far as social media is concerned, there have been reports that TikTok has been prioritizing, say, a more Palestinian anti-Israel message. Is that true?
My expertise is more the campus than social media, but what I can tell you is anecdotally talking to students, they are deluged with anti-Zionist messaging coming both generally from the discourse and also oftentimes from their campus itself.
Could one of you just comment in general? I'm going to come back to the lack of intellectual diversity on college campuses. And the lack of diversity is usually strong. What they have is an overwhelming tilt towards left-wing progressivism on campuses. Do you believe that's part of the problem on campuses? Sure. Either one of you. Ooh, sure.
Certainly, Congressman, it can't be coincidental that we have on so many campuses an environment that has become so hostile to Jews and Israelis at the same time that anti-Zionist attitudes are so prevalent within the faculty themselves, and those anti-Zionist attitudes are sometimes coupled with left-wing ideology.
Do you see any correlation between anti-Israel views and anti-American views? Does it attract the same breed, same type of person?
Some of the same extremists who attack Israel and its positions are also attacking the United States.
Isn't it almost always true? I mean, insofar as you can identify people in front of
all I can say is we see it all the time.
Okay. Final question. I think we're having a lot of people from other countries come here. And we've had a lot of horrible incidents, say, at MIT. And the percentage of students at MIT coming from other parts of the globe is very, very high. Is there a correlation between new people coming here, either as foreign students or just people coming from other countries? Is there a correlation between these and the anti-Israel extremists? Do you see some of these people causing trouble?
I don't have data, but I can say that we see trouble both from people who are born here and people who come here from other countries, both.
You don't think that when you see the high number of people coming from at MIT and the high number of protests, there's no correlation between the foreign students and the people demonstrating?
I don't have data, but anecdotally we are seeing foreign students as well as native-born among the perpetrators.
Thank you.
May I respond, Mr. Chairman? Since he had thrown his question to anyone who wants to comment.
I'm sorry, time's expired.
Okay.
Right. I'd like to, Ms. Bonamici, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to start by responding to my colleague and expressing extreme concern about the notion of placing everybody in the same category and assuming that anyone that comes from a particular country or has a particular color of skin shares certain beliefs. I think that's hugely problematic. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses. We know anti-Semitism has been a threat for centuries. Ms. Burdett, you talked about prevention. I want to note that in my home state of Oregon, in 2019, the legislature required education about the Holocaust. They just updated that legislation earlier this year to include a required curriculum about Jewish history and culture. Those are obviously steps in the right direction, but now post October 7th is undeniable that we are experiencing an enormous and concerning rise in anti-Semitism and other hateful and discriminatory rhetoric, especially on college campuses, but not limited to college campuses, I might add. Sadly, too often in these situations, it's become violent and threatening way beyond constitutional free speech protections. I understand this is a hearing about anti-Semitism, but it's important to recognize there's also been unprecedented surge in anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias and hate. There's a significant dangerous threat to a mosque that's in the district I represent. That's wrong too. I hope we can all agree that every student has the right to be on a campus where they not only feel safe, but are safe, especially when discussing and debating important and controversial topics. That's not happening today. We heard from a student about that. We know anti-Semitism has repeatedly reared its ugly head in the form of hateful rhetoric and disgusting images and symbols, and now it's back in levels we have not seen in our lifetime. We need a unified, empathetic, and appropriately nuanced approach from this committee in Congress. Title VI gives us the opportunity to do that. I want to note that after 9/11, our federal government did not do enough to protect Muslims amid an alarming rise in Islamophobia and violence toward and hate crimes toward Muslim Americans. We can learn from that and realize that we have to take action. I'm grateful for the rapid response by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, OCR, to remind colleges of their obligations to protect Jewish students, Muslim students, students of all faiths against discrimination. I'm also very grateful that OCR has expedited an update to its discrimination complaint form, so hopefully campuses can access the resources and support they need as soon as a discriminatory act occurs. Following up on Mr. Courtney's question, Ms. Burdett, there's a push among my Senate colleagues led by Help Committee Chairman Sanders to include a 27% funding increase for the Department's Office of Civil Rights in a supplemental appropriations bills. I support this and hope that a similar bipartisan effort takes shape in the House because of the bipartisan consensus that we're hearing about addressing what's happening on college campuses. So, Ms. Burdett, how could OCR use these additional resources from Congress to fulfill its responsibility and protect civil rights of students and combat any faith, race, or ethnicity-based discrimination? And would you please also, I know you wanted to respond to Mr. Grossman's question as well.
Well, I'll start with the Department of Education. I mean, I am an advisor to professionals on campuses, and complaints are going to go up. Congresswoman, if tomorrow you were a senator and you got to only bring your House staff it would limit how effective you could be. And so this is just common sense that we need to capacitate this organization, because later, members of Congress will criticize that office for not moving quickly enough and for having a backlog. And I can't be a Jewish person and not remember that we were viewed as foreigners who were dangerous. 2/3 of the American public in 1938 believed that Jews in Germany were responsible for the persecution that the Nazis were bringing on them. And we weren't allowed to come here because people believed we would be German spies and we would be a fifth column in this country. And so hate comes from everywhere, and so do acts of good people. And so that kind of profiling, it's not backed up by the data. You're members of Congress. You can access information about people who come to this country. My understanding is that they commit crime at lower rates than our own kids. So thank you for that
Thank you.
opportunity.
And, Mr.
Congresswoman.
Chairman, as I yield back, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, condemning Islamophobic actions on college campuses in Maryland and Texas, and importantly, an article from the Washington Post titled, "Colleges Braced for Anti-Semitism and Violence, It's Happening." Thank you, and I yield back.
No objection. And I would like to recognize Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Tartak, we're all sorry, I think, to hear, would hope everyone, that how you've been silenced and threatened on the Yale University campus. What do you think college administrators who are committed to combating anti-Semitism, what should they do to protect Jewish students on campus?
Sure. So first of all, I think that they have options. I think what they say matters, and when they make condemnations of anti-Semitism that are just full of what I'll call all-sidesism, that cannot simply focus on anti-Jewish hatred and have to bring in, quote, all forms of bigotry, they're making a huge mistake. I think that they can also de-recognize and defund student groups that promote violence and that support terrorist organizations recognized by the United States government. I'll give you an example. I also gave one in my testimony, but another because there are so many. National Students for Justice in Palestine on their Instagram commemorates somebody who planned multiple suicide bombings in one of the intifadas in Israel. There's a commemoratory post to mourn this person's death. So maybe SJP chapters that repost something like that, of course, within the boundaries of the First Amendment nitty-gritty, of which I'm not an expert, but maybe they could experience some sort of scrutiny, if not consequences.
Well said. This equivalency where you have to lump everyone in together instead of speaking specifically to the issue at hand of anti-Semitism. Even this White House, as soon as you mention anti-Semitism, moves to Islamophobia. And then specifically, the colleges don't have to sanction or subsidize or condone these groups that are obviously hate groups and anti-Semitic groups. What would you estimate the ratio to be of students on campus that would be pro-Israel versus pro-Hamas?
Ooh, well, it depends on the college campus, which is relevant.
But how about at Yale?
Sure. So at Yale, I would say pro-Hamas, as in would show up to a rally shouting something along the lines of, or quote, verbatim, resistance is justified. 20% of the student body.
20%?
Sure. Because,
wow. How about the professors?
Ooh, also a good question. It also depends on the department. But a good example was this event that I went to called Gaza Under Siege, where the panelists presented Hamas as a resistance movement. And that was co-sponsored by 5 or so university departments, as in majors: the Religious Studies Department, the Women's Gender and Sexuality Department, Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, our Center for Middle East Studies. So I think administrative backing says a lot and maybe answers your question.
That is incredible that you would estimate that perhaps 20% of Yale students might show up to a pro-Hamas rally, a true pro-Hamas rally. And, one has to wonder what happens on our college campuses. And in light of, and I keep bringing it back to this, and I'll do it once again, in light of the border invasion facilitated by this administration and the individuals who are in our country now, aided by this administration, when this happens here, what we saw play out on October 7 in Israel, when this happens here, it'll be interesting to see how on our own college campuses the response is. And these professors that are in many cases subsidized by tax dollars, not specifically at Yale in terms of it being a private university. Mr. Marcus, to you, if I may just pivot, should universities like Yale be able to hide behind the First Amendment, or should there be consequences when we see this kind of this anti-Semitism played out, or this expression played out on college campuses?
Congressman Good, the problem isn't just that there are students who are saying the wrong thing, but universities that are doing the wrong thing, and we need to start with the grown-ups. They need to begin by saying we will do no harm. They need to look at their DEI programs. They need to look at their curriculum. They need to look at programs like Middle East Studies programs with a one-sided anti-Israel propaganda that is simply fueling the problem on campus.
Yeah, are you concerned about, we know there's billions of dollars flowing to college campuses from countries such as Qatar, China, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, countries that don't hold the same values that we do, and it's even there was a study by the Anti-Defamation League. It's a report that showed how money from Iran is actually being funneled to universities that support anti-Semitism. Are you concerned about the impact that these foreign influences on our college campuses might be having on the spread of anti-Semitism?
I am, sir, but I want to say respectfully that a lot of the money going to it is our own money from the U.S. taxpayer. So a lot of it is either federal money, or it's state money, or it's student activities fees. But yes, it is also true that foreign money is coming in and having questionable influence.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I'd like to recognize Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today and for your testimony. As a 40-year retired college professor, I'm appalled at the recent reports of anti-Semitism that we've seen in this country and the demonstrations of hate overall. Anti-Semitism has been a serious issue in this country. It's been ongoing and it's existed for a number of decades. We've seen hate, unfortunately, trickle down to many parts of our society, and today we're looking at our colleges and universities. It's horrible to me that students are being attacked simply for who they are, and every student, regardless of race or religion, deserves the right to study and to learn safely on a campus, and they deserve the right to walk on the campus and just be there and feeling safe about it. Ms. Burdett, in your work at the Anti-Defamation League, you developed policies and strategies and programs to prevent and counter anti-Semitism. So can you discuss briefly some of the strategies that you use to help schools combat anti-Semitism, and in your experience, how have the institutions responded to these strategies?
So institutions in general in this country want to do better. And working as a lobbyist for the Anti-Defamation League was like, most of the time was like falling through an open door. I think institutions need outside partners and expertise and validators and supporters. But one of the most important strategies and things that we have learned as a country is that where there is data, action follows. And where campuses have programs that incentivize and promote reporting and make it even more comfortable for students to make a report, they can look at their problem and quantify it. And the fact that, everyone on this committee could actually ask their own police department to start reporting to the FBI. And I just can't emphasize enough that if you have a diverse city in your district that is reporting 0 or 1 hate crime, it's not credible, and we all know it. And so reporting, even schools that have a policy against bullying, and bullying, by the way, hurts Jewish people and our brothers and sisters in other communities, Where a policy is posted online and promoted, children are safer. There are less suicide threats among kids. And so these kinds of spotlights that we can put, and then I've talked a lot about prevention. Prevention really matters, because once a hate crime has happened in a family, some families will actually never recover from that trauma. And I think we've all seen cases like that.
Thank you. We've seen so many traumatic experiences throughout our college campuses. I've worked particularly with our HBCUs and others. Hate anywhere is a terrible thing. You've talked a little bit about the Office of Civil Rights and the fact that we need to fund this department, because when we look at the fact that we've had an uptick in Title VI complaints, and the years that the Republicans have been in the majority, the Office of Civil Rights has either been underfunded or not funded at all. But I want to ask you about, since you mentioned diversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on college campuses were designed to address potential issues among the different demographics. There's been a recent surge in attacks against DEI programs. I've heard many of my colleagues use this argument. So what role can diversity, equity, and inclusion programs play in responding to anti-Semitic and racially hostile acts on campuses? We've got about 37
I don't know a single Jewish person who isn't very scared right now. And I don't know a single Jewish organization or Jewish school principal or rabbi that wants the civil rights infrastructure of this country to be decimated. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion work maybe wasn't set up to anticipate a group of mostly white people scared of hate crimes, but it can be enhanced, and the people that I work with have adapted and are protecting Jews now. So don't bring it down on account of us. We need it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, acts of hate emanate from hearts filled with hate. And our colleges and universities have an obligation to ensure that they do not cultivate an environment of hate or racism by their action or by their inaction. The heinous acts of hate evidenced by the terrorism undertaken by Hamas on October 7th may be the most prominent recent example of hate-filled anti-Semitism, but the hearts that undertook this terror are not isolated just to Hamas terrorists. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism has found a prominent and a safe refuge on our college campuses, and this is simply unacceptable. Let me be clear, there is a distinction between free speech involving honest debate on college campuses on the one hand, and support for groups that call for the annihilation of another race on the other hand. Surely that difference is clear to the reasonable observer. One of the ways that I think colleges and universities have promoted anti-Semitic speech and behavior is through their DEI offices, and we were just talking about that a second ago. But staff at diversity, equity, and inclusion departments on many college campuses are noticeably anti-Semitic, and they go about their work in a manner contrary to the stated intent of treating all with equity. 2021, Mr. Chairman, you referenced a study that Heritage did, a report on anti-Semitism of DEI staff at universities. They conducted a search of Twitter feeds of 741 DEI personnel at 65 universities to find comments regarding Israel and, for comparison, China. Those DEI staff tweeted, retweeted, or liked almost 3 times as many tweets about Israel as tweets about China. And notably, of those tweets about Israel, 96 were critical of the Jewish state, while 62% of the tweets about China were favorable. Consider that for a moment. The DEI staff favor China and oppose Israel. In my view, this explains in large part the lack of response towards anti-Semitic instances by DEI staff on college campuses, and it seems clear to me that there are a number of higher education institutions whose DEI staff are disconnected with the values and strategic objectives of the U.S. What's more, they are clearly anti-Semitic. Ms. Tartak, I want to talk to you because you're at Yale University presently, and I noticed just doing a little Google search of Yale back in April, Yale brought in, on the second night of Passover, they hosted a speaker, their DEI office hosted a speaker known to promote anti-Semitic views, including justifying the murders of Jews and Israelis.
I want to talk to you about your experience and whether or not the DEI office at Yale has offered you any support. Have they, in fact, offered you any support?
Again, no. Assuming you're referring to Huria Butelja, who there's a photo of her holding a sign that says, again, verbatim, Zionist to gulags. The DEI office did not do anything to prevent the event. It was, as a matter of fact, as you stated, supported it. And of course it was hosted during a Jewish holiday where Jews couldn't show up. Similarly, my friends and I were unable to get into a recent pro-Hamas event co-sponsored by so many departments at Yale. They don't help.
Yeah, and I presume that in the past 5 weeks since the Hamas attacks in Israel that the DEI department at Yale has not provided you any support or frankly provided you assurance that you're going to be safe and secure in your own college campus as a result of the anti-Semitic speech and actions on that campus.
No, they haven't. Again, for the most part, my Jewish peers and I have receded exclusively into Jewish centers of life on campus. And what's upsetting about this uniquely is that DEI, at least a lot of what I've been seeing, fails to recognize that Jews can be oppressed, but only recognizes Jews as some kind of white oppressor, which to me doesn't really make sense as a Persian Jew on one side. My mom escaped revolutionary Iran in 1979, and on the other side, my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. His mother, brother, and sister were shot by a Nazi firing squad, and so to have an institution look at me and say, you are the oppressor, really should frighten us all.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And Ms. Burdett, you mentioned earlier, I think you used the phrase that some DEI offices were not, quote, set up to look at certain white individuals as those folks being oppressed. And I think that's one of the big problems with DEI offices is, frankly, we start categorizing people by how they look or what their race is instead of looking at the heart of folks and understanding what true hate is and what true hate is not. And it works against the values of American democracy, and frankly, it works against the morality that undergirds the freedom that should be evident and should be there for all members of the human race. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. I'm glad we're having this hearing. Frankly, it's about time. We've seen anti-Semitism on the rise across the United States and around the world, including a 40% increase in anti-Semitic incidents at colleges and universities, and that was before the October 7th Hamas attack. Sadly, since October 7th, the ADL has found an almost 400% increase of anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses, including so many of the incidents we've heard about today. As the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, I strongly condemn all of this anti-Semitic activity. And sadly and inexplicably, far too many college and university leaders have totally failed to fulfill their moral responsibility to clearly reject hatred, violence, and anti-Semitism. There is much more we can do to counter anti-Semitism and protect Jewish students. And I'm very eager to work with any of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work on this issue. In fact, in August, I helped lead 87 members of Congress on a bipartisan and bicameral letter to Secretary Cardona, urging the department to take concrete steps to clear the backlog of pending complaints, to prioritize the pending proposed regulations, and to implement key commitments in the U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
No objection.
Thank you. Mr. Marcus, I am so grateful to you and your colleagues at Brandeis for your work. In April, the Biden administration reached a milestone settlement with the University of Vermont on anti-Semitism, and would you view that as a success?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, the Louis D. Brandeis Center filed that complaint jointly with Jewish on Campus, and we view it as a success, and it is our understanding that there has been a dramatic difference on that campus since the resolution.
And would funding the OCR fully, pushing forward on issuing regulations and implementing the U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, would all of those things help lead to a greater number of similar successful resolutions to instances of campus anti-Semitism?
Respectfully, I don't think I can say I'm convinced of that. I headed OCR during 2 administrations. There have been arguments for and against increases or decreases, often on party lines. My sense has been that think about anti-Semitism as an issue that seldom occupies even 0.1% of intake. Maybe it will be. So to me, fluctuations in the budget of OCR are not what impacts the ability of OCR to address anti-Semitism.
So let me ask you this question, because we know that there are a record number of 19,000 complaints that OCR received last year, and yet a tiny number of those, I think only 5, are related to anti-Semitism. And I think since October 7th, only 8 or 9 complaints have been about anti-Semitism. This is shocking in light of what we hear from students when we talk with them on campuses, what we hear in the press. So why is it that we've seen such a significant increase in anti-Semitic incidents as reported by students, by others on college campuses, and yet what we're seeing filed at OCR is only a tiny percentage of those claims? What's getting in the way of students filing complaints?
Students are often reluctant to file complaints against their university for reasons that vary from loyalty to their institution, to ignorance of the availability of the process, to fear that it's not going to be successful. We're now seeing more complaints coming in, and the Brandeis Center will have more to come, but I really think that it is incumbent on OCR to proactively investigate cases and not just wait for complaints to come in for exactly the sorts of reasons that you've just mentioned.
So college is a time when young people find themselves and decide what they want to be. And I am deeply concerned that what young Jews are facing today on college campuses, the shocking anti-Semitism, is going to force them to decide that they are simply safer if they hide what's Jewish about them, if they do not take part in Jewish life, if they abandon that part of their identity. So I just want to urge my colleagues, we need to do more to address this issue. My time is expiring, and I thank all the witnesses today.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize Mrs. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding time and for holding this important hearing today. And I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for being here, and particularly Ms. Tartak for being here to share your story. It's shocking to see what's happening in our society, what's happening on our campuses. There's something wrong with the moral fabric of our society when you have anti-Semitism rising in the way that we are seeing today. And it's hard to believe that we're here, particularly when we've seen the atrocities that Hamas have committed against the state of Israel in October. These were barbaric, inhumane, and deserving of strong retaliation. 1,400 innocent individuals brutally murdered, hundreds more still held hostage by Hamas, and 30 Americans killed in these attacks as well. And on these college campuses, in many cases, no mention made of any of that in these protests, no mention made of Hamas as a terrorist group. Instead, we're seeing, as you said, Ms. Tartak, Jewish students retreating to their Jewish centers in our college campuses. So it's totally unacceptable and should be called out for what it is. It's a hate crime. And unfortunately, far too many institutions of higher education are failing to do their duty to protect Jewish students and faculty from this aggression. And I think you've heard today that members of this committee are resolute in condemning anti-Semitism, and I'm hearing that on a bipartisan basis. And we continue to stand firmly behind Israel, behind Jews here in America, and behind Jewish students on college campuses. But I think about where do we get here, and Rabbi Hauer, you mentioned in your testimony that anti-Semitism has been cultivated in our K through 12 system, and then that spreads to institutions of higher education. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I just want to give this background as well. There's an effort in Pennsylvania to teach about the Holocaust in our K through 12 system, led by a professor at Penn State. I've visited some of the schools that have implemented teaching about the Holocaust at a young age, and how to do this. It's a difficult subject, and how to do it with very young students. But what is going wrong beginning in our K through 12 system that we're at the point where we are today?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I would use the word myself, cultivated. I think what we have seen very clearly is that the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of environments that have been created in university campuses, which until very recently we only found in university campuses, we are now finding in K through 12, or specifically middle school through 12 environments. From our perspective, we have something called Jewish student unions, which are clubs which are held in public schools, and hundreds of public schools across the country for Jewish students who want to attend the club in the school hours. It's constitutional to be able to do so. We have had, especially since October 7th, but preceding it as well, but incredible spike in it since October 7th, descriptions of exactly the kinds of things that have been described here as occurring on university campuses. Rallies in middle and high schools, our clubs, students coming in to a club of Jewish students sitting in the back and disrupting and making it impossible for the Jewish students to carry on, and then in fact chasing the students back towards their classrooms. We've had teachers in high schools who have been doing art projects of showing, for example, a fist emblazoned with the Palestinian colors going through the Israeli. Kinds of things which are making students deeply uncomfortable. It didn't happen before. And in a certain sense, I think that's especially compelling for us to consider in Title VI discussions, because universities, it's been there for a while. It's going to be a big project to dial it back. In K through 12 schools, it's just beginning. It's just beginning, and we have to address it very, very firmly.
I know I'm out of time, but I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts on how can we change that in K through 12s? How important is education about the Holocaust? What can we do differently? But I don't have time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for coming and sharing the stories about the eruption of anti-Semitism on our college campuses. And I almost feel like I want to apologize on behalf of people who really recognize that that is simply wrong. It's horrendous. Anti-Semitism has no place in American society. And like my colleagues on both sides, I'm appalled by the eruption and what's happened since October 7th because of that. Rabbi Hauer, you correctly note that anti-Semitism on campuses has persisted for generations. I often tell the story of how when my father attended college on the GI Bill, both Jews and Hispanos were barred from fraternities on his campus. And this was just after the world had witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. The importance of allies is really key. And I think my small, teeny tiny little northern New Mexico story of allies and historic anti-Semitism is sort of just a little piece of that. But we also most recently remember the anti-Semitic hate spewed by the white nationalists as they marched through the University of Virginia in 2017 at the Unite the Right rally. And much of this anti-Semitism on college campuses and in the rest of the nation has deep ties to white supremacy. Ms. Burdett, can you please speak to the link between white supremacy and anti-Semitism in America?
Thank you for that question. You know, one of the reasons it's so important to make sure that anti-Semitism awareness is incorporated into our civil rights work, our diversity work, our inclusion work, is because a lot of experts believe you can't adequately understand hate in America without knowing about anti-Semitism. It is such a strong, animating ideology for hate in America. And we should remember that Jews are not targeted because we worship differently. Remember that the shooter of the Tree of Life synagogue, Yamach Shmo v'zichrono, that's Hebrew for may his name be erased. He did not shoot those people because they were praying on Saturday or because they were praying in Hebrew. He subscribed to an ideology whereby Jews were responsible for so-called the browning of America. We are part of the movement for diversity in this country, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in our homegrown hate groups are very pernicious and really drive a vast, vast majority of ideologically motivated, biased murders of Jews in this country.
Right, and this idea of hate and promoting power and acquiring power by using hate to get it in all of its forms, I think is really pernicious, as you point out. And you pointed out also in your opening testimony about the Biden administration's national strategy for counter anti-Semitism earlier this year, and about the importance of Congress acting and making sure we provide the resources. Mr. Courtney raised the issue earlier, but what does a 25% budget cut to the Department of Ed's Office of Civil Rights, as proposed by the House Republicans' appropriations bill, affect? How would that affect the ability of that office to investigate and, if necessary, as pointed out, take strong action when universities fail to counter the anti-Semitism, when they fail to protect the students, as we heard from the witnesses as well? Ms. Burdett?
I've heard my friend Mr. Marcus speak eloquently about what the Office of Civil Rights could still do more of with less. But that's not how any of us run organizations and programs. I know that a 12% decrease in capacity has not helped them tackle rising cases. And I just don't understand. We know the cost of communities that are ripped apart, campuses that are ripped apart. It's just penny wise and pound foolish not to do things that we know deter and prevent these crimes.
Thank you very much, and my time has expired. I had wanted to have time, and I might submit a question in writing, because you also talked about the importance of using anti-Semitism, and that piece is important within DEI. Your community is part of it, my community is part of it, so I'll submit a question in writing to address how that is important to the witnesses. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that actions speak louder than words, and I want to put colleges and universities on notice that if you permit or harbor anti-Semitism on your campus, you are my enemy. Say that emphatically. I want to draw attention to the shocking hypocrisy that I see on display on our college campuses. If you rewind just 5 or more weeks ago, our academic institutions have gone from rightly denouncing Holocaust deniers, not permitting them to speak, and even in many cases firing them from their positions. But now, just in the last 5 weeks, universities are defending and protecting supporters and perpetuators of Holocaust 2.0, and that is Hamas. The atrocities on October 7th can only be understood as a new Holocaust, and the pro-Hamas protests on universities not only celebrate the massacre of Jews, but call for the massacre to continue until all Jews in Israel are murdered or evicted. Yet what we see is university presidents, faculty and board members, and donors shockingly silent or deliberately reserved in their actions to identify, rein in, and remove these intimidating protesters from our academic institutions. The contrast of protecting supporters of a new Holocaust, while only a few weeks ago rightfully canceling deniers of the Nazi Holocaust, is troubling and baffling. Mr. Marcus, do you mind, can you help me understand this shocking incongruity in values and integrity that has taken place in just the last 5 weeks?
The masks have really come down, and we're understanding that the problems on campuses are much worse than what we ever saw before. I do think that the issue might even be worse than what you're suggesting, because these Holocaust 2.0 deniers, in some cases, are not only celebrating the murders, the rape, the torture, the desecration of corpses, but they are saying we are part of this resistance, part of the Hamas murder, rape, and torture. Now, to the extent that they are part of and supporting it, there are questions under Terrorism Act. We cannot have a situation in which there are registered student organizations using facilities of federally funded institutions that are saying that they are a part of a movement which is State Department designated as terrorist. So I would say that this is a problem for which we need to have very specific attention from the federal government.
So I certainly agree with you, and back to my statement of actions speak louder than words. Can you provide any direction on whether federal funds can be removed from universities that continue to be these hotbeds of anti-Semitism, or even taking it another step to remove accreditation from universities that fail to adequately address anti-Semitism on their campus?
That sort of action requires a number of different steps, as it should. There is a lot of process that is required under federal law, but you need to take the first step first. And the first step means taking action, which can mean beginning with self-directed investigations. It can mean establishing a compliance review. You cannot even get to the point that you're discussing, Congressman Williams, unless you proactively take those initiatives, and that's what we would want to see the Education Department do.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. Ms. Burdett, my alma mater, University of Pennsylvania, they have students that are chanting, these are pro-Hamas protests, chanting, "There's only one solution." Earlier you mentioned that there were standards on bullying. Would you call that bullying? Just a yes or no answer would be helpful.
Yes.
Thank you. Would you call that hate speech?
The entire statement that is around what you have quoted is hate speech, I believe.
What I hear from students in my district, Jewish students in my district, is that they're afraid to go to classes. That's unacceptable. For these Hamas protests, would you call them inclusive?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
The protesters that line up to espouse pro-Hamas sentiments, would you, and you're an expert in DEI, would you call that inclusive?
Well, I'm an expert in anti-Semitism, but the defense of terror and massacres and hate violence is unacceptable.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Macbeth.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Owens and Ranking Member Scott, and also thank you to your staff and to our witnesses for being here with us today and making this hearing possible. And Ms. Burdett, once again, thank you so much for your witness and testimony. I heard your testimony last week in another committee. Acts or expression of hatred, racism, and anti-Semitism have no legitimate place in our society or on a college campus. And I'm glad to see that the Higher Education Subcommittee today coming together for this important discussion. Students will tell you that they are feeling unsafe, as we have heard today. And in volumes, we have heard this. And we have a responsibility to them to do everything that we can to foster communities of understanding, safety, and respect for each other on our college campuses. While the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians on October 7th have incited a recent larger wave of anti-Semitism on campus and elsewhere around the country, this is not an entirely new development. This rise in hate is well documented by groups such as the Anti-Defamation League and is unfortunately becoming more and more normalized. In 2022, ADL documented almost 3,700 separate anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States in just their yearly audit. This translates to over 10 anti-Semitic incidents a day in 2022, a 36% increase in the amount from the year before, and the highest number recorded since ADL began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in the late 1970s. Something is seriously wrong when in the last 5 annual reports by ADL, 3 of them have reported the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents recorded in the 50-plus years that this data has been collected. My community in Metro Atlanta, I represent Georgia, is no stranger to these incidents. It should never be considered normal, but it occurs far too often. A few years ago, I myself participated in a joint press conference with interfaith leaders in my community, local law enforcement, the ADL, and the Council General of Israel to the southeast to condemn anti-Semitic vandalism that was happening in our neighborhoods. And just over 2 weeks ago, anti-Semitic messages were displayed on an overpass above I-75 in my county, Cobb County, a home to one of the largest Jewish communities in the Deep South. And I am pleased that the Biden administration is responding with their release of the National Strategy to Counter Antisemitism earlier this year. And as you stated in your testimony, and I quote, "The strategy's launch in May of 2023 was the most ambitious, far-reaching action in U.S. history. Also historic is the coming together, both from within and outside of the Jewish community, a kind of civic unity and resolve to tackle anti-Semitism through concrete, coordinated action to stop the spread and the normalization of anti-Semitism." And that is your quote, Ms. Burdett. Ms. Burdett, I wholeheartedly agree with you that this was an important step, and you've been talking about that today over and over again, about the importance of us supporting the Biden administration's actions and strategic action and work that they've done on anti-Semitism. But can you also discuss further, because I apologize, I've had to run in and out to other committees as well, can you discuss further some of the other actions that the federal government can and should be taking in response to these very disturbing rises in anti-Semitism on campuses specifically?
So, Congresswoman, the kind of action you described, standing with other faith leaders, that matters. When President George W. Bush called on America not to take out their anger about the tragedy of 9/11 on their Muslim neighbors, people listened. And the Department of Education officials, the president, the vice president, and officials across all of the agencies are talking more to Jewish people. They are listening, they are elevating their stories, and they are standing next to them. Your microphone is, aside from your checkbook, which I've already said is very important, your microphone is an incredible tool. And when people fight about Israel in the public debate, Jews get hurt. And when, as we've heard today, we talk about immigrants as potential invaders who would come here and act like Hamas, hate incidents against people who look like immigrants are going to go up. And that is no comfort to the Jewish community. So words matter and your microphone matters. And thank you for your work.
Well, thank you so much in amount of time. And thank you, all of you, for your witness and testimony.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Marcus, you helped draft President Trump's 2019 executive order extending civil rights protections to Jewish students on college campuses. That was 4 years ago. President Biden has since expanded the order combating anti-Semitism. Do you feel that your efforts have been vindicated given what we've seen over the last 6 weeks?
Thank you, Congressman Banks. Yes, what was expanded was the notion that Title VI includes Jewish students and should always include Jewish students. That was something that I first announced during the George W. Bush administration in guidance. It was expanded during the Obama administration, and then President Trump further, and now Biden. Yes, that's important. But there was another half. There's another half of that approach, which is to use a definition that will give clarity to what is anti-Semitism. This was also part of the Trump executive order. I would like to see that get equal support from this administration. They say they're following it, but the regulation that's due next month, we've not been hearing about, and I think I would like to hear about it from them.
I appreciate that explanation. Specifically, the order empowered the federal government to withhold funding from any college or university that enabled anti-Semitism. And at the time, many Democrats attacked it, right, when President Trump released this important executive order. In fact, my colleague from Washington State, Ms. Jayapal, said, quote, "It will do nothing to protect Jewish students. Instead, it'll usher in a climate of fear for campus activists." But Richard Blumenthal, a senator, went even further, and he said this: "It smacks not only of what happened in the Soviet Union, but also Nazi Germany." Mr. Marcus, do you think President Trump's executive order served to, quote, "usher in a climate of fear for student activists on campuses"?
Just the opposite. It's the most important tool we have, and that's why the Biden administration is saying that it is still active policy.
And would you say that these kind of comments comparing civil rights protections for Jewish students to Nazi Germany have aged very well for these two Democrats?
Without commenting on members of Congress, what I would say is this: support for measures like the executive order on combating anti-Semitism should be bipartisan. It is based on ideas that have been accepted by the Obama administration. I don't see why it cannot be more broadly accepted among people of goodwill of all persuasions.
Yeah, I hope, back to my initial question, that you do feel vindicated, that these outrageous, outlandish, offensive comments from these two, and there are so many more that I won't spend time reading today, are ridiculous. And we appreciate the important work that you did, that President Trump led in his administration, and I just think it's really important. Rabbi, why has the American left abandoned the Jewish people? I mean, this seems to be a change in Democrat versus Republican, right versus left politics over the last several years. A historically powerful political constituency of the left, the Jewish voters in America, they largely feel abandoned by the American left. Why is that?
I'm not sure I'm the most qualified person to theorize why. I think it has already been said by some of my colleagues, the themes of the oppressed and so on and so forth, which have dominated, and somehow we have been lumped in, not with the oppressed, but with the oppressors, very unfortunately. I can tell you that it has been incredibly disorienting to the Jewish community to be in this specific place. Thou shall love the stranger, v'ahavtem et hager. It's a biblical mandate. It's a Jewish value of eminent value. I speak to you as, quote unquote, a stranger. My father was a Holocaust survivor who came to this country. My mother was a Holocaust refugee who came to this country. If we didn't love the stranger in this country, we wouldn't be here. This Jewish community wouldn't be here. None of us, from one end of the table to the other, would be here. We deeply value inclusion. We deeply value caring that nobody in this country, nobody in any university of any specific or any particular identity should feel estranged. And we've been champions of this. and today we feel excluded by it.
Like all of you, I wish these issues were bipartisan, but it doesn't feel like it anymore. Combating anti-Semitism, supporting Israel, supporting the Jewish people doesn't feel bipartisan like it used to. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Chairperson Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to discuss this very, very important issue. Rabbi Hauer, I've struggled since the explosion of anti-Semitism on college campuses began after October 7 to understand why campus leaders have been so timid in their response. As you testified, the Orthodox Union supports Jewish students on many campuses around the country. Your organization and the students you support interact with thousands of campus faculty and leaders. In your opinion, why have we not seen a robust response from the universities? And I'll do some qualifiers. Is it cowardice? Is it that they actually support Hamas? Is it that they don't want to offend foreign donors? All the above. What is it that's causing such a timid response?
To me, it seems that it's a combination. It's a combination of ignorance and a lack of courage, Ignorance, I don't know that people have taken the time to look at the hard evidence of what the Jewish people are facing, what the State of Israel faced on October 7th, what it has faced since really the beginning of its existence when it was announced, and when its creation was announced. They haven't looked at a state which, if you look at a picture of the Supreme Court of Israel, or you look at the picture of the faculty of any hospital in Israel, you will see a mixture of leadership of Arabs and Jews, and they don't understand that on another side there's literally an assumption of a state that would be Judenrein, that would be empty of Jews. And that ignorance is huge, and at the same time cowardice. Cowardice because, as we've seen, there is a movement. There's a movement which is very, very strong in the academic and in the student community that for some reason has chosen to not be sympathetic to the Jewish community, and it would require strength on the part of administrators to do this. But we believe firmly that institutions of higher learning are not excluded from teaching basic values, and they need to stand strong. I think it's that combination.
Thank you very much. Your testimony is very powerful. By the way, all the testimonies will be on our website, and I want to encourage people to read them. Mr. Marcus, I don't have too much time left, and I have a question for you and a question for Ms. Tartak. You talked about the work of the Biden administration is doing or not doing to address these issues. You mentioned the department put out a couple of Dear Colleague letters reminding institutions of their obligations under Title VI, but you also point out that the department has the authority to open self-directed investigations and compliance reviews of institutions' compliance with Title IV. You mentioned that earlier. Could you just briefly talk about that?
Sure, and I've also praised the national strategy. The administration has been pushing out links so that people can file complaints and putting additional language on their complaint form. But they don't have to wait for complaints to come in. They have the power to begin the investigations tomorrow. They can do it on a case-by-case basis, ad hoc, or in a national initiative. Either way, and it seems to me they should be doing both.
Thank you. Ms. Tartak, thank you very much for your bravery. Thank you for standing up to the hate, ignorance, threats, intimidation, and everything else you're experiencing. I can't imagine being an undergraduate student and displaying the courage you're showing. As you know, we care a great deal about free speech on this committee. We've actively pushed back on efforts to stifle legitimate speech on grounds it might offend someone. Why is the speech that you've been subjected to different? In other words, what's meant by phrases like resistance is justified?
So I'll, of course, again, leave it to experts to interpret the First Amendment, of which I'm not one. But what I do know is that speech that is harassment, intimidation, or can lead to violence simply should not be allowed on college campuses. And it's been, I think it's quite clear that that's what a lot of this is. Students who cannot get from one side of campus to the other, such as a Jewish student at Harvard who was on his way to class and was assaulted by a group of other students yelling shame, that can't be allowed. We need to get from one side of campus to the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses for joining us today for this very important hearing on the abhorrent rise of anti-Semitism on our college campuses. Hamas's barbaric terrorist attacks against innocent Israeli civilians on October 7th shocked the conscience of the free world. And in fact, this morning, we began with a viewing, working with the Israeli embassy, of the horrific, heinous atrocities committed by Hamas terrorists against Jewish civilians, babies, the elderly, young people at a festival, innocent civilians. These were atrocities. These were met, unfortunately, with callous cruelty at universities across America, including at my alma mater, Harvard University. Instead of leading with moral clarity and condemning Hamas's terrorist attacks, university administrators at Harvard and other institutions failed their students through enabling the promulgation of horrific anti-Semitism, which has now evolved into violent attacks against Israeli and Jewish students. As the world watched in horror after October 7th, over 30 radical student organizations at Harvard released a joint statement outrageously claiming that Israel was entirely responsible for the Hamas terrorist attacks carried out against innocent Israeli civilians. Unfortunately, following this statement, Harvard leadership remained silent for 2 days, allowing their silence to create a vacuum that was filled by the voices of repugnant actions of the anti-Semitic student organizations. My question, and I'll begin with Mr. Marcus, what role should university leaders play in condemning clearly and explicitly anti-Semitic statements like the one that the Harvard student organizations posted after October 7th? And what actions should administrators take to root out anti-Semitism on campuses across America?
At a minimum, they should condemn anti-Jewish harassment with the same vigor as they do other forms of discrimination, and we're not seeing that at Harvard or in other places. But beyond that, when you see 30 student groups who are celebrating atrocities like that, you need to have tough conversations throughout your university about what you are doing to harbor this. At Harvard University, we, on behalf of 3 clients, had found discriminatory conduct which the university agreed was a violation of their own policies, and we're not seeing significant responses to that. When administrators fail to address acknowledged anti-Semitic activity, they should not be surprised when it gets even worse.
My follow-up, Mr. Marcus, is how have you seen the curriculum at American institutions of higher education shaped to foster these environments where hatred has been cultivated among the student body, and specifically curriculum that calls for the eradication of the State of Israel and the genocide of the Jewish people?
Let me give you just one example, and that's Middle East Studies programs that are funded under Title VI of the Higher Education Act by the Congress of the United States. There is now legislation on the books that requires Middle East Studies programs to certify that there will be a balance of perspectives and a diversity of views. And yet, what, if anything, is done to ensure that's happening? I would certainly like to see scoring of the applications. I would like to see some follow-up. I would like to see action when institutions fail to honor the commitments that they are making in writing to the U.S. government.
I want to submit for the record, Mr. Chair, the letter dated October 13th of Republican members of the House and Senate who are also graduates of Harvard University. I was proud to lead this letter condemning the failure of the administration to speak out explicitly and clearly. I've called for the resignation of President Claudine Gay, and we will continue standing up with moral clarity that is so very much needed on college campuses in this country and around the world. And I yield back.
No objections. Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Burnett, has there been a rise in anti-Semitic, racist, and Islamophobic activity in the last 10 years or so?
Yes, there has.
And what's been, do you know, can you attribute it to anything?
It's very hard, as many members have tried to do here, to prove a causality. But I already mentioned that when President George W. Bush called on Americans not to be violent and hateful with their Arab and Muslim neighbors after 9/11, it does make a difference when leaders use their microphone to say that there were good people screaming, "Jews will not replace us," in Charlottesville. That is terrifying, and it still is. And the way that some leaders have turned a blind eye to anti-Semitism when it's not coming from someone that they disagree with has been heartbreaking.
So you're contrasting how George W. Bush reacted and President Trump reacted to those events?
Wouldn't want to, but I don't have a choice.
Well, Mr. Marcus, you mentioned the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. How would that be helpful if it were enacted?
Ranking Member Scott, that statute would implement the Executive Order 13899 on combating anti-Semitism and would do two things. First, it would give durability to the notion that Jews are protected under Title VI. That principle is a creature of dear colleague letters and an executive order. I would certainly like to see it have greater strength, and that's important. Second,
And that's because religion is not covered under Title VI, but we have, from an operational point of view, included anti-Semitism under Title VI. Is that true?
exactly right. And the second part is that it would direct agencies, including the Office for Civil Rights, under appropriate circumstances to consider the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which indicates that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but some of it is, and providing relevant context gives examples to guide decision makers.
Have the activities that we've been discussing do they violate Title VI, in your opinion? So that enforcement of Title VI could address many of the problems that we have?
The failure of universities to provide prompt and effective response after many of the incidents that we've discussed would be a violation of Title VI, in my opinion.
And you've heard that the pending budget for the Department of Education includes significant cuts in the Office of Civil Rights, and you've mentioned the backlog of cases. What would the ability of the Office of Civil Rights, how would the ability of the Office of Civil Rights be affected if those cuts actually took place?
In my opinion, it's not the budget that drives performance on anti-Semitism for a couple of reasons within OCR. One is that anti-Semitism cases are such a tiny percentage of the overall intake that fluctuations, even if they're significant, don't necessarily affect that. And the second is that with a small number of significant high-profile matters, it's really a combination of political will and management that's made the difference on those periods where it's been dealt with effectively and those not. So
that would require you, however, to ignore the thousands of cases that are pending for other kinds of discrimination under Title VI. Is that right?
No, I don't think that those should be ignored. I think that they can all be handled. The Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights can really address any issues that are high on the priority list while also addressing the bulk of them as well. Changing the budget might have other sorts of effects on the agency, but not necessarily, in my opinion, on anti-Semitism matters.
Well, sure, you could take that, but you'd have to ignore, I mean, you only got, if you cut the budget, you're not able to do as much. And there are many problems with civil rights that the the Office of Civil Rights has to address. If you cut the budget, you're not going to be able to address them as well. I mean, that's just simple arithmetic. And if you're not going to criticize the cut in the enforcement agency that's going to enforce the problem, that's going to deal with the problem you've complained about, that's not helpful. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, for hosting this important hearing. American citizens are horrified to watch foreign nationals who have been allowed into our country on student visas threaten American students based on their religion. No foreign national should ever be allowed to threaten an American citizen on American soil, period. I'm leading a letter to the Department of Justice to ask for an investigation into the funding sources for the organizations coordinating these violent protests. If foreign terrorist organizations or sanctioned foreign nationals are funding and coordinating these violent threats to Jewish students on American campuses, the DOJ must act. If foreign students who are here on student visas threaten American students, their visas need to be revoked immediately. Colleges and universities must suspend foreign nationals who are threatening Jewish students based on their religion, and the DOJ must uphold the responsibility to defend the religious liberty rights of American citizens. And then, Rabbi Hauer, I have a question. This hearing is obviously focused on anti-Semitism on college campuses. However, in your testimony, you do note that anti-Semitism has spread from post-secondary education to middle and high schools. What are you hearing from middle and high school Jewish students around the country?
We're hearing just that it has spread. They have begun to experience the general environmental anti-Semitism, which comes from vocal rallies, speaking strongly and sharply pro-Hamas, celebrating those who would destroy their own people. They have experienced as well issues in the classrooms, and they have experienced a whole lot of interpersonal one-on-one bullying via social media and otherwise. There's a difference that happens in those spaces between when the administration reacts promptly and effectively and when it doesn't. That's all the difference. Mm-hmm. And we, who again have many such students in these environments, when the administration reacts firmly, clearly, and addresses it, it's a whole different story. Of course there's going to be hate expressed in this country, but it festers when we let it.
Absolutely. And when the students report the bullying, are the school administrators taking action to protect them? Or
sometimes they are, and sometimes they are not. And we, unfortunately, I received from one of our clubs where there was a very, very clear situation of anti-Semitism, and the forms were filed, and the school didn't even classify it as a hate crime. So you have ugly instances like that of blatant failure, and at the same time, you also have wonderful school administrators who are doing the right thing. I think we're in a place and a time where those who are doing the right thing have to be lifted up, and those who are doing the wrong thing need to have consequences. One of the things which we note all the time is that they're the only people who are not experiencing fear right now are those who are making others fearful. There's no fear of consequences, and a discussion about Title VI is a discussion about creating that fear of consequences.
Well, absolutely, we need strong leadership from our president making decisive statements against this. And thank you, Chairman. I yield my time back to you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Marcus, and everyone else for your testimony. We had a discussion last week about steps that the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights could take, and myself and the chair of this committee, Representative Owens, have incorporated your suggestions in a letter we've sent to the Assistant Secretary, as well as Secretary Cardona. And so we'll certainly keep you apprised on the response we get, and any further suggestions you have would be much appreciated.
Thank you.
I did want to take a moment to respond to a member of this committee who earlier tried to explain away his vote against a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. Apparently, he had quibbles with a couple of factual details in two of the numerous examples listed in the resolution and the many countless examples across the country. How you could use that as a pretext not to take a strong stand against anti-Semitism right now is really beyond comprehension for me. But I did want to just make clear that this is a very small fringe minority view in this House of Representatives. That resolution, which I worked on with Chair Owens, passed overwhelmingly with over 99% of the Republican conference and over 90% of the Democrat conference. So that fringe group of 20 or so people, they don't represent their own party, they don't represent the House of Representatives, they don't represent the United States government, which has been unified on a strong bipartisan basis in supporting Israel and fighting against anti-Semitism. But those 20 or so do, in a meaningful way, seem to represent much of American academia when you look at what's going on at universities in this country right now. And as the testimony has made clear, this has been going on for some time. And I'll give you one very clear example of just how pervasive it is. A few years ago, in California, there was a piece of legislation passed in the legislature that asked a group to come up with, or the State Board of Education, to come up with a model ethnic studies curriculum. So the State Board of Education appointed a commission of faculty members from across the state, and they went about their work and came up with a curriculum that was universally condemned on both sides of the aisle for being overtly anti-Semitic. The California Legislative Jewish Caucus said it used anti-Semitic tropes, that it denigrated Jews, and that it, quote, echoed the propaganda of the Nazi regime. Even Gavin Newsom, the governor of our state, said it was offensive in so many ways and would never see the light of day. And then in the aftermath of October 7th, we've seen all too many student groups, and in some cases, faculty, have used this moment to push forward their agenda of hatred towards Israel and of anti-Semitic rhetoric and even the targeting of Jewish students. And so, we watched we had a classified briefing this morning, members of the House watching raw footage of the horror of that day. And, I think we have to be very careful anytime we draw historical parallels. But when you study the events of the 20s and 30s in Germany, it's hard to understand how so many, even leading intellectuals of the day responded with indifference or in some places complicity. And I just have that same, sense of deep puzzlement right now. How is it that our leading academic institutions, these are supposed to be the most forward-thinking places in our country, have become the sites for fomenting anti-Semitism? So I just wanted to, maybe Mr. Marcus and if any others have any thought on that as to why it is, what is it about the nature of the modern academy in the US and in other places as well, I would say, that has caused so much to go awry?
I'm glad you're mentioning ethnic studies because that is an important part of the puzzle of how things are getting so bad, and it is driven by higher education but is having an impact on K-12. Studying ethnicities is not inherently bad. It can be done well, but unfortunately the contemporary field of ethnic studies, especially liberated ethnic studies, has become both politically extreme and also anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. We've had to file a case together with the American Jewish Committee, Anti-Defamation League, and Stand With Us against one school district in California that has extreme problems, but there are problems in many districts throughout California, and now they're coming east as well. To the extent that you have a curriculum that creates stereotyped, antithetical views of the Jewish people, it should not be surprising that students become miseducated and that the problems become worse.
Can I add for the last 10 seconds that I think part of the issue of academia is that it's super partisan. So there is, of course, not just politically, but just intellectually. So there's this X, Y, or Z belief that we have one side and there's another side. And right now, because there's supposed to be this wholesale embrace of so-called oppressed groups, that also includes an embrace of Hamas, which is why it's easier for them to condemn white supremacist attacks against Jews and harder for them to condemn Islamist attacks against Jews.
I'd like to just add that in the 1920s and the 1930s, I don't know about academia, but the United States House of Representatives stood by and did nothing and blocked the rescue of Jews. So I do think reconciling with our past is very important. We shouldn't do it selectively. It is important. I do think the Holocaust is a very instructive thing to look at. Comparisons are tricky, and they're not really necessary, unfortunately, because we have an explosion of followers of Nazi, racist, white supremacist ideology in our country today. And that ideology has at its center anti-Semitism, racialized anti-Semitism, and conspiracy theories. So this is a very serious subject, and learning about the apathy that left Jews to be slaughtered during the Holocaust is very important, and we can also be looking within our own shores and our own institutions, and it is important to do so. So thank you for raising
I yield back.
history.
I'd like to recognize Mrs. Scott for his closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of the witness testimony. All students have a right to attend colleges and universities and be free from discrimination and harassment. And this right is enforced by Title VI, the Office of Civil Rights. Witnesses have exposed the reality that many students, in fact, do not feel safe. This is not new and not just limited to one group of students. So I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, as we address the problem, starting with avoiding cuts in the Office of Civil Rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Without objections, I enter into the record a statement from the Morse Life Holocaust Learning Experience, highlighting actions of the state of Florida has taken to require the teaching of the Holocaust within Florida schools. And I'll just go ahead and give my closing statements. I want to first of all say that we asked the question, how could this happen? And it's another deeper conversation, but it's called the Marxification of education. We have, over the last few decades, have within our system Marxists who divide us versus bring us together, and we have to recognize that and teach our kids what that looks like. That being said, I want to thank each and every one of you. This is so timely, so informative, and particularly Ms. Tartak, thank you. It's very exciting to see our young people standing up and doing the right things. I watched this myself as a 12-year-old in the 60s, grew up in the days of KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation. It was the college kids that came and sat at these counters, college kids that actually demonstrated in front of movie theaters because they knew what the American dream was, and they were willing to stand up and articulate that, so I appreciate that. This is very personal to me because I've lived it. I grew up in the 60s. I was the third black American to have a football scholarship at the University of Miami. So I know what it is to walk into a room and feel hate, try to walk into a movie theater, or be characterized and judge my intelligence or my character based on my skin color. And we've come so far from that point, we should never, ever look at being turned back. At the age of 18 years old, I saw firsthand my first experience with anti-Semitism. It was shocking for a young man who'd never been around white people. I thought all white people accepted each other. It was just amazing to see that. To see here 60 years later what's happening across our country, the evil that happened on October 7th, and for us not to automatically, instinctively stand up against it says a lot about where we are. Because hate is taught. It's not in our DNA. And I say that because I grew up in a time where even dating a different color was not looked upon as being a positive thing. Where we are 60 years later, my family, 6 kids, we represent black, white, Hispanic, American, Indian, and Trinidadian. We call each other family, and my grandkids call each other cousins. That is the American way. That's where we were drifting to until we found this nexus of hate within our college campuses. This is where we're finding Black Lives Matters, who hate not only whites, but Jews in America. This is where we find Antifa, that hate black businesses. This is where we find the pro-Hamas, who hate Jews, Americans, anything that stands against our American way. And this is something we cannot allow to continue to happen. We are, no question, seeing on our college campuses cowardice or complacency with our administrators, and we're going to have to do something about that. We're not in business of using taxpayer dollars to provide and nourish hate. We just don't, that's not the American way. So thankful for this moment, we'll begin to kind of take a look at that. I just want to leave a quick message to my, my friends in Utah. Utah is a remarkable state because we are very embracive, we're very entrepreneurial, we have a strong faith. We can lose that overnight if we're not careful. And I want to, they're now, my college friends, my state representatives there, they're now dealing with the curriculum that they're going to have to figure out if they're going to accept or not. I just want to read a little paragraph from what they're now looking at. This is K through 12, by the way, to the point which I just mentioned earlier. With the goal of equipping students with the skills and knowledge they need to identify and overcome oppression, Voices provide a counter-narrative to U.S. history and dives into stories of discrimination, resistance, and resilience. We do not need a counter-narrative to America history. We need to teach American history. If you do that, you find a country that's unified, that believes in meritocracy, that begins to look at each other inside out, not outside in. That is the American history, and that's what we've done to become a more perfect union. And to see this kind of hate, by the way, one thing to say about those who preach hate, age does not matter to them. The earlier they can start, the better. And you see that in Gaza right now, where young, innocent boys and girls are taught to hate another person just because they're different. So we're going to get past this, our country, in a bipartisan way. We now realize we do have an issue. It's not getting better, it's been getting worse. We need to hold colleges accountable. They give us a bad product, they do not deserve our government dollars anymore. I don't care how popular their name might be. They can't give us kids that come out productive, proud of who they are, proud of our country, proud of our history, and working together as we the people. If they can't give us that, then we need to have other options out on the table, and American people will choose those better options every single day. So I want to thank you guys again for what you're doing, for your courage, and with that, this hearing comes to an end. Committee is adjourned. Thank you. Okay.